Thunder rolled over Rome like the voice of a furious god, but even the heavens could not drown the cries spilling from behind the emperor's private chambers. Marble corridors shuddered with noise, not of war, not of debate, but of something far more sinister. Senator Lucius Marcus stood frozen, a torch trembling in his hand, its flame flickering against polished stone. His breath came shallow and uneven, yet when he tried to avert his eyes, the guards flanking him spoke with chilling calm. "Hold it steady, Senator. The Emperor demands proper light." Behind that heavy door, there was no feast, no council, no ceremony, only the destruction of innocence disguised as imperial right. A girl, barely 14, was stripped not only of childhood, not even of personhood, but reduced to an entry in Rome's ledger of pleasure. Fathers who once led armies, authored laws, and carried honor in the forum, now stood as torchbearers to their daughter's ruin. The empire that had conquered nations was devouring its own families. This is not legend, this is not gossip, this is history. The most horrific sexual practices of Caligula the Insane. When news of Tiberius's death spread through the marble halls in March 37 CE, Rome exhaled in relief, as though reborn after decades of suffocation. For 23 years, the empire had endured the weight of his paranoia, his endless treason trials, his shadow-soaked corridors where whispers alone could end lives. The Senate was exhausted, the people numb, and even the Praetorian Guard longed for a new star to follow. That star came in the form of a young man whose very name carried promise, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to commoners and soldiers alike as Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname from his childhood trailing his father, the beloved General Germanicus, through muddy battle camps. To Rome, he wasn't just emperor by blood. He was heir to Augustus, grandson of Hope, a boy raised among soldiers instead of cloisters, the prince of the legions, the child who had walked among ordinary men. His rise was celebrated like a festival of salvation. The forum thundered with cheers, fireworks of relief lit the skies, and citizens dared believe that dignity might return to Rome. In his first months, Caligula seemed to fulfill every hope. He entered the capital not with Tiberius's cold suspicion, but with youthful charm and generosity. He gifted bonuses to the legions, cut crushing taxes, and staged spectacular games that bathed the Colosseum in blood for days on end. Senators applauded, whispering that perhaps Rome had found a ruler with Julius's fire and Augustus's mercy. Hardened men wept as he entered the Curia, convinced they had been delivered from the shadows of tyranny. Altars smoked with sacrifices. Families prayed with gratitude. In the markets, people called him the Dawn after a long winter. The empire had waited too long for someone who smiled, who laughed, who seemed human. But behind the marble mask of promise, darker threads were already being woven into his reign. At first, it was subtle, a faint crack in a perfect statue, easy to ignore. A servant girl vanished from the palace kitchens. Officials claimed she fled in fear of punishment, but whispers said her corpse surfaced in the Tiber, mutilated so grotesquely that even hardened guards refused description. Then 2 more slaves disappeared, a boy of 15, a girl of 17. Their bodies too drifted back downriver, faces frozen in agony. The palace said nothing. The emperor smiled in public as though nothing had happened, and Rome, drunk on relief, chose to dismiss the whispers. Was he not young? Was it not natural for a man of power to test limits? Surely time would temper his appetites. Surely responsibility would come. These were the excuses senators whispered to themselves, even as fear began to coil beneath their skin. The mask shattered in October 37 CE, 6 months into his reign, when Caligula was struck by a sudden and violent illness. All Rome held its breath as word spread of his fever, his delirium, his body writhing between life and death. Priests filled temples with sacrifices. Citizens prayed with trembling lips, begging the gods to spare their young emperor. Hardened soldiers who once mocked omens found themselves whispering desperate pleas to Mars and Jupiter. When at last Caligula rose from his bed, pale but alive, the city erupted in celebration. Families feasted, altars smoked with thanksgiving, and the Senate hailed his recovery as divine intervention. But those closest to him swore. The man who rose from that sickbed was not the same as the man who first wore the purple. The fever had scorched something deep inside him, leaving not gratitude, but a chilling certainty. He had brushed against death and returned untouchable. From that moment forward, he no longer saw himself as mortal flesh bound by law or morality, but as a living god, above decency, above restraint. At first, his new appetites hid beneath the glitter of palace banquets. Wives of senators received invitations to dine privately with the emperor, summons they could not refuse, and their husbands dared not question. Noble-born boys were offered the honor of palace service, only to discover that honor meant rouge on their cheeks, silks across their bodies, and the humiliation of being paraded as ornaments. Still, Rome looked away, muttering excuses. He was young, indulgence would pass, time would steady him, but indulgence did not pass. It hardened into ritual. The palace guard was reshaped, not men of duty, but men chosen for cruelty, soldiers bound not by oath, but by shared depravity. A freedman named Helen was elevated as master of pleasures, quickly learning that survival meant procuring whatever obscenity Caligula demanded. By the summer of 38 CE, the cracks in Caligula's mask tore wide open. In the imperial archives, a new ledger appeared, not for grain or taxes, but for human beings. Each entry, written with the same cold precision used for state resources. Only now, the resources were women and children, daughters of senators, wives of equestrians, sons of merchants. One by one, stripped of identity and reduced to inventory, Rome, the so-called beacon of civilization, had become a marketplace of human dignity, auctioned off at the whim of a single man. What began as hidden cruelty behind locked doors grew into state machinery, whispered depravity turning into codified policy. What was once rumor became ink on parchment, tallied by scribes who recorded agony with the same detachment they used for grain shipments. Scrolls filled with names turned into numbers, ages and beauty catalogued like livestock. In those lists, Rome's daughters became property, and as each entry was inscribed, the soul of the empire rotted further. Senators who once strode the forum with pride now crept through palace halls with haunted eyes, knowing their families had become weapons. To resist meant a daughter's name inked into the ledger. To question a decree meant a wife summoned to service. Silence meant only a delay. Caligula's appetite was never satisfied with strangers. It was nourished by destroying the untouchable bonds that held Roman society together. When senators were first ordered to hold torches as witnesses to their own children's violation, the transformation was complete. Depravity was no longer a private indulgence, it was official state doctrine. The cruelty reached beyond the body. It invaded the mind. Fathers became accomplices, mothers silent witnesses. The empire itself became corrupted at its most intimate level. Palace architects were commanded to design not chambers of beauty, but of acoustics, rooms that amplified screams so they carried through adjoining halls, ensuring those awaiting their turn could not escape the sound. Torch brackets were fixed at exact heights, so witnesses had no obstruction. Caligula demanded not just victims, but observers. Degradation had no value unless it was seen, recorded, shared. Guards drilled senators like soldiers, where to stand, how high to hold the flame, how long to remain still. A drooping arm, a whispered protest, and another daughter's name would be added to the ledger. Thus, the most powerful men of Rome, whose ancestors once dictated laws and marched in triumph, were reduced to trembling torchbearers, their voices silenced into shallow breaths, their honor traded for survival. Rome ceased to be merely an empire of conquest. It became an empire of terror turned inward. If senators were broken into silence, what chance had merchants, peasants, or slaves? Whispers spread of noble women who entered the palace never to return, of sons from proud households sent back painted and perfumed, their childhood stolen. Stories raced through taverns and markets, but no one dared to confront it. Speaking truth was a death sentence. Truth meant attention, and attention meant the ledger. The genius of Caligula's cruelty lay not only in the destruction of bodies, but in the slow destruction of Rome's will to resist. By forcing Rome's most powerful men to stand complicit in their own family's torment, Caligula transformed rivals into prisoners, bound not with chains of iron, but with the shackles of shame and silence. The ledgers themselves, fragments of which survive today, expose the chilling precision of this nightmare. They note acquisition dates, compliance ratings, and classifications that read more like trade accounts than records of human suffering. Victims were graded by utility, their worth calculated by beauty, age, or political leverage. The language stripped them of personhood, reducing them to inventory. Item 247. One entry reads, female, senatorial rank, restricted assignment. Behind that sterile phrase was a life shattered, a family destroyed, a father forced to hold a torch to his daughter's violation. This was Caligula's true innovation, turning atrocity into administration, cruelty into a system, evil into efficiency. By early 39 CE, the transformation was complete. What began as whispers in shadowed halls had hardened into a full institution of horror. Guards drilled their routines. Architects perfected rooms of torment. Scribes filled scrolls with numbers, their quills scratching without emotion. And senators, once sworn to defend Rome's dignity, now shuffled like ghosts through corridors, holding torches that lit not only their daughters' suffering, but the collapse of Rome's soul. Private depravity had become public doctrine. Rome had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Among all his outrages, none cut deeper into Rome's marrow than Caligula's deliberate violation of family itself. At first, his lust consumed the wives of senators, the daughters of merchants, but his obsession soon turned inward toward his own blood, toward Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, his sisters. Women who carried Augustus's lineage, who should have embodied the untouchable dignity of Rome. To defile strangers was tyranny. To defile one's own sisters in front of the Senate was something far darker. It was spectacle, designed not only to gratify desire, but to announce to the world that nothing was beyond his reach. The unveiling came not in secret, but in blinding light, at a banquet with 300 senators, priests, and foreign envoys. Golden lamps glowed. Musicians plucked strings to mask unease. Senators forced smiles as dishes were carried in. But the hall froze when Caligula, reclining at the head of the table, drew his sister Drusilla into his arms, shattering every law of Rome, every taboo of civilization, every boundary carved by centuries of tradition. The room suffocated. Men stared into cups, women gripped goblets until their knuckles whitened. All understood this was not scandal. This was sacrilege. Then Caligula's voice rang out, calm, deliberate, my divine sisters, blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection, as Juno shares his. The illusion was no accident. By invoking Jupiter's incest with Juno, Caligula cloaked his desecration in divine precedent, leaving the Senate trapped between applauding blasphemy or committing treason. And so they applauded, hollow claps echoing across marble, sealing their daughters' fates with silence. The bond between Caligula and Drusilla had already been whispered about. During the fever of 37 CE, she alone was permitted to remain in his chamber, while priests and physicians were dismissed. Upon his recovery, he proclaimed her not just sister, but divine counterpart. He moved her into the chambers of wives and sent her husband into political exile under the guise of a distant governorship. Their intimacy was no longer hidden. Drusilla became the centerpiece of his rituals, seated beside him at audiences, presiding at religious ceremonies as priestess and consort, forced nightly into humiliations that mocked Rome's deepest values. Julia Livilla, fiery and defiant, resisted until punishment silenced her. Agrippina the Younger, sharper and colder, buried her fury, storing every insult like coins saved for vengeance. But resistance was futile. Rome itself had become Caligula's stage, and his sisters unwilling actresses in his theater of desecration. When Drusilla became pregnant, Caligula's madness reached its height. Draped in purple and gold, he stood before the Senate and proclaimed the child in her womb was no mortal life, but the offspring of a god, heir to rule both heaven and earth. The Senate, whose voices once shaped empires, bowed in obedience, decreeing honors for an unborn child of incest, paraded as miracle. Priests slaughtered sacrifices. Citizens were commanded to pray for the infant. Rome, once proud of its laws and dignity, now celebrated the annihilation of its moral foundations as divine spectacle. But fate intervened. In June 38 CE, Drusilla died suddenly. Some whispered childbirth complications. Others whispered poison, delivered by hands too weary of humiliation to endure further. The truth, like so much of Caligula's reign, was buried with her. His grief did not soften him. It shattered the last, fragile boundary of his humanity. In the aftermath of Drusilla's death, Caligula elevated her beyond mortality. He proclaimed her a goddess, ordered temples built in her name, and commanded oaths to be sworn by her divinity. Rome was forced to worship the woman he had destroyed, enshrining victimhood itself as a state religion. For Julia Livilla and Agrippina, her death brought no relief, only deeper torment. They were compelled to impersonate their dead sister, to wear her robes, speak her words, and embody her spirit in grotesque parodies of ceremony. To resist meant execution. To comply meant surrendering the last fragments of dignity. Witnesses later testified that senators were summoned to the palace and forced to watch as Caligula demonstrated his divine bloodline, taunting them. "If I can do this to my sisters, imagine what awaits your daughters." The message was unmistakable. No law, no tradition, no relationship could shield anyone from his will. The bureaucracy recorded these events with chilling detachment. Ledgers logged ceremonies as if they were shipments of grain dates, witnesses, outcomes, all noted in clinical shorthand. Sisters became property, wives became currency, children became entries, and Rome itself, by documenting every detail, became complicit. What made Caligula's desecration so devastating was not only the violation of flesh, but the way it poisoned the very concept of family. The Roman household, the paterfamilias, at its center had always been the cornerstone of order. By transforming his sisters into consorts and his daughter into a goddess, Caligula shattered that foundation. In silence, senators bowed when ordered, applauded when commanded, and recorded each horror as though it were procedure. Rome betrayed itself, not through defeat in war, but through complicity at home. For here, incest was no private vice. It was state ritual. It was humiliation woven into policy. It was proof that nothing, not even the sacred blood of family, stood against the hunger of one man who had crowned himself a god. His true innovation was not indulgence, but organization. He clothed depravity in the garments of administration, turning the imperial palace into a bureaucracy of abuse. Scribes, priests, physicians, and senators all became functionaries in a system designed not just to gratify, but to perpetuate degradation. In the east wing of the palace, beneath ceilings painted with goddesses and nymphs, he founded what inscriptions called the Temple of Divine Service, a name that mocked religion itself. To the casual visitor, it appeared a sanctuary, altars smoking with incense, hymns echoing down marble corridors, statues gazing serenely. But behind that facade, wives and daughters of senators were processed not as worshippers, but as offerings. Their humiliation was masked as ritual, their exploitation disguised as piety. The machinery of abuse ran with the efficiency of a treasury office. Every act was logged, every body accounted for, every indignity copied in duplicate records stored in the archives. Senators seeking imperial favor were issued ivory tokens marked with chamber numbers and times, appointments where their wives' dignity was traded for contracts, their daughters' purity exchanged for commissions. Performance notes were kept, enthusiasm scored, revenues tallied. This was Caligula's insurance. The archives preserved proof of complicity, signatures, and seals of Rome's most powerful men. Once a senator had stood by while his wife or child was processed in the temple, he could never speak against the emperor again. His silence was purchased, his shame weaponized. Caligula consumed not just bodies, but reputations. Even this system of ritualized exploitation did not satisfy him. His ambition reached further into the future itself. Thus was born the breeding program, a nightmare that reduced human reproduction to industrial process. Physicians trained in Alexandria, men who once swore oaths to heal, were ordered to examine women like livestock. They measured hips, charted fertility, calculated probabilities, and dictated pairings as if matching cattle. Young women of senatorial class were assigned to soldiers, gladiators, even foreigners, combinations chosen for strength, beauty, or exotic traits. These unions, forced beneath the gaze of guards and scribes, were recorded with cold precision. Pregnancies were tracked with obsessive detail, diets prescribed, movements restricted, miscarriages punished. Births were logged as inventory, not miracles. The children were seized at birth and classified for use. Strong boys sent to military training, delicate boys to palace service. Attractive girls reserved for temple rituals, less favored children condemned to labor. In this, Caligula achieved his final innovation, not just the corruption of family, but the industrialization of lineage itself. Families were no longer families, they were categories. bloodlines were dissected into functions, childbirth reduced to a mechanism of servitude. But perhaps the most grotesque perversion of Caligula's machine was reserved for Rome's sons, noble boys, heirs to the Republic's proudest names, transformed not into soldiers but into ornaments. In the north wing of the palace, mirrored chambers became theaters of forced metamorphosis. Boys were bathed in scented oils, stripped of boyhood, and redressed in silks that mocked their lost identities. Hair was braided with flowers, faces powdered into masks of submission, voices strained into higher registers until they cracked, movements rehearsed until they glided, not like warriors, but like courtesans. Their names, Marcus, Lucius, Gaius, were erased and replaced with Flora, Lily, Rose. Floral mockeries to sever them from lineage, to erase their place in history. The archives record them not as sons of Rome, but as attendants, rated by beauty, grace, obedience. Senators were forced to select and rank the children of their peers as though they were merchandise on display. Resistance brought punishment, compliance brought shame. In either case, Rome's future fathers were broken before manhood, their dignity extinguished in the glare of mirrored walls. Fragments of ledgers from this period reveal the precision of a conscience turned to numbers. Names, ages, classifications, assignments, revenues. Marginal notes suggest inventory increases before festival season. Another praises the high return on younger categories. A third recommends narcotics to pacify resistant subjects. Suffering itself had been transformed into an economic resource, optimized by administrative efficiency. By the end of 39 CE, the palace no longer resembled the heart of empire, but a factory of exploitation. Departments handled procurement, classification, breeding, and training with the discipline of a legion. Guards secured acquisition, physicians ensured function, scribes ensured documentation, senators ensured silence. The sacred cornerstone of Roman life, the family, had been dissolved into units of revenue and compliance. Nothing was sacred, not birth, not lineage, not childhood, not even gender. Everything could be rewritten, reassigned, reduced to ink on parchment. But if there was one ritual that epitomized Rome's collapse under Caligula, it was the invention of the torchbearer's duty, a practice so cruel it turned protectors into accomplices, and fathers into unwilling witnesses of their daughters' annihilation. The summons arrived at dawn, sealed with the imperial crest. A senator was commanded to appear with his eldest unmarried daughter, prepared for illumination duty. The wording was cold, bureaucratic, detached, yet beneath it lay certainty. Refusal meant death, not just for him, but extinction for his bloodline. Brothers executed, wives enslaved, children scattered among soldiers. Compliance was not a choice, but a sentence. The torchbearer stood in a corridor 50 feet long, marble walls lined with iron sconces, each man placed at measured intervals, so that when the chamber doors opened, the flames would fall perfectly across the victims inside. Architecture itself had been weaponized, designed so that no father could escape the sight of his own child's destruction. Guards patrolled the line, warning men to keep their arms steady. To falter was to invite harsher punishment. Some fathers recited Virgil to distract their minds. Others whispered numbers to vanish into abstraction. But nothing could silence the sounds, muffled cries, breaking voices, the emperor's mocking laughter that seeped through the oak doors. Men who once commanded legions now stood frozen, reduced to shadows, holding torches that burned brighter than the honor they had already lost. On those walls, graffiti carved by trembling hands remains Rome's most honest testimony. "We are the damned who breathe, the dead who walk." Another scratch plea, "May the gods forgive what emperors compel." These fragments survive not as resistance, but as despair, the final record of a society that surrendered its conscience to silence. The desperate need of men was to leave behind proof that they had been forced into complicity, that their silence was not chosen, that their torches had illuminated nightmares they could not prevent. In the forum, fathers who had once been rivals passed each other with hollow eyes, carrying the unspoken knowledge of shared humiliation. Their voices subdued, their spirits shattered. Some drank themselves into oblivion. Others fell on their own swords. Most endured, walking the marble halls of Rome as if alive, though in truth their souls had already been extinguished in the corridor of torches. The cruelty did not end when the chamber doors closed. Daughters who emerged after hours of torment could no longer meet their father's gaze, not out of blame, but out of unbearable memory. Families fractured, bonds dissolved. Silence became their only language. A father who had once been the shield of his household became the symbol of its destruction, not by betrayal, but because survival had demanded it. And so every home in Rome was poisoned with invisible rot. Mothers clutched their younger children, terrified they might be next. Sons looked at their fathers with suspicion, knowing the man who once held the torch might one day hold it again. In this way, Caligula's policy extended far beyond the palace. It reached into every Roman household. It turned love itself into a weapon. The most sacred bond became the most corrosive form of control. Even after his assassination in January 41 CE, when Praetorian blades cut him down behind the curtains of a theater, the wounds did not heal. Killing the man could not erase the system he had created. The ledgers remained. The sconces remained, fixed into palace walls, silent bronze monuments to families destroyed and daughters reduced to numbers. Archaeologists in later centuries uncovered them, their mathematical precision confirming the testimonies of ancient writers. They found ledgers where the daughter of a senator was transformed into item 247. They found scratched notes where boys once trained to become attendants, voices of despair that no fire could erase. The ruins of Caligula's palace spoke not of glory, but of shame. Not of triumph, but of torches that once lit Rome's moral collapse. His true legacy was not only his madness, nor even his death, but the lesson that unchecked power, fused with administrative precision, can transform human beings into instruments, into numbers, into entries in books that outlive their bodies. Rome never recovered from the stain. Trauma carried forward for generations. Daughters who flinched at thunder, sons who grew into men unable to lead, families who whispered of past dishonor but never spoke aloud. This was the empire's true wound. Not political instability, not assassination, but the invisible scars carved into the soul of its people. And so, when we speak today of the sexual practices of Caligula the Insane, we are not trading in rumors of decadence or anecdotes of excess. We are staring into the abyss of a system that transformed family into theater, dignity into spectacle, and survival into complicity. The ruins still stand. The torch holders are still fixed in marble. The echoes still whisper through those empty corridors. And perhaps, in those halls, the lesson still lingers. When evil wears the mask of procedure, when power finds satisfaction in systematic destruction, the result is not merely the fall of an emperor, but the collapse of humanity itself. If this story unsettled you, if it revealed how fragile civilization becomes when morality is surrendered to madness, then remember, history does not fade. It warns, and if you wish to explore more of history's darkest truths, like this video, share it, and subscribe to this channel for more journeys into the shadows, where power and horror intertwine.